So, um, um, thank you for answering my invitation. So,
Thank you
like,
very much for having me.
so for those who didn't know you that much, can you like introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, so my name's Tom Farrow. I'm a performance coach. I've been working in 12 years. That started off in rugby with Wasps Rugby and progressed from there into a little side track into athletics with Speedworks and a bit with the English Institute of Sport with GB kayaking. And around that time, I started working with England Rugby Sevens as well, um, which was like something we'll talk about a bit as we go, I imagine, because that was a great place to sort of hone some of these ideas around change direction, deceleration, and movement. I was with them for 6 years in total, and after finishing there, shortly after that, started with Wolverhampton Wanderers in the Premiership football, and more recently, I've just been with Chelsea since January, which is I'm finishing now and focusing more on my own company, which I've been working in alongside. I co-founded with Ian Taplin, co-director of the company Retail Performance. So we've always worked in a lot of different sports, team sports, over the last sort of 6 years, and so I'll be focusing on that now.
Nice, nice. So, um, the first question I want to ask is like, there are more and more coaches are getting interested into like deceleration. So, can you like explain why is there like coaches are gaining interest in like decel?
So I suppose part of it is maybe our ability to monitor and look at that a little bit more closely than we've been previously able to. I suppose the other element is as we try to refine our understanding of sport and movement and injury, we're looking for different elements that to seek to understand. Obviously, high speed running within team sports was probably one of the first focus of once GPS became available. People were talking can become a little bit more reliable, then maybe Excel D cell started to get a bit more focus. And maybe it's a little bit of a more complex thing to understand, hence why high speed running was the initial focus, and it's progressed on to include things like Excel D cell from a monitoring perspective. Um, and ultimately, it's a key aspect of team sport performance. And if you can decelerate efficiently, you can change direction efficiently, you're going to create more space for yourself and then ultimately for your team in attacking situations, and in defensive situations, you're going to be able to close down the opponents a lot more effectively. In football specifically, the things like high press and have become more prevalent within team tactics, and a massive element of that is going to be your ability to decelerate. So maybe that's an element of the game's demanding more of it at higher intensities, so it's getting a little bit more focus for that as well.
Cool. So, uh, if it's you, how would you like start introducing deceleration for your athlete?
So I suppose the first thing for me is with anything that was sort of implemented is understanding where it sits in the bigger picture. So I suppose I'll start by zooming out, and the first thing I'm looking at within team sports is essentially like, I've said this a lot for a while, but um, you know players only really ever exist in the moment, and they either solve the problem in front of them or they don't. Okay, there's like nothing we can do that guarantees they're going to solve that problem, but there's certainly stuff we can do that can influence their ability to do so. So we sort of need to appreciate that there's nothing that we can do that absolutely guarantees performance, but within that constraint, then so deceleration really is a part of a bigger picture of movement around the pitch. So for me, when I'm working with team sports athletes, I sort of think for a model of I've got a speed agility model and continuum. I've got a conditioning model and continuum, and then I've got a contact skills model and continuum, which has some element of importance within football, but obviously more importance in the sport like rugby. And within all those frameworks, I'm thinking, how do I go from a more general focus on that area to a complete game specific, what transfers the most to the game? And obviously the thing that is always going to transfer most to the game is the game itself. So I sort of start with that, and through working in a variety of different environments, I think, you come out of university as a young coach thinking, things like, basic exercises are going to be really, really important. Maybe like everyone needs to be able to squat a lot and something like that. And quite quickly you're met with the reality that there's some amazing athletes who don't do that or can't do that, but they can be very good at the sport. So one of the things I sort of came up with in my head a while ago was like the best players are the best players because they're the best players. Like, some are faster, some are fitter, some are stronger, some are more powerful, but the best ones solve the problem presented to them better than anyone else. So that's where my starting point is. Okay, what are the problems that the players we're working with are facing on the pitch? So you can start to break down the movements and the situations in the pitch that require deceleration. So that's really important as a starting point for me, because I think whatever we do, we need to be able to tell the story from what we're doing to why it matters with the athlete. And it can't just be, because I say so or because of them, footage or discussing with them. And in my experience, they implicitly get that quite quickly once you start to carry that over. So once I've got this end of the continuum, like understanding what the most important thing is, I then start to unpick that. So in terms of like speed and agility, agility is obviously solving a change direction scenario with a perceptive element, with a problem-solving element. And then change direction ability would be a component of that agility, agility ability. And then deceleration is a component of change direction. So, I'm working back like that. And then the model I use is the continuum then goes from the skill itself. So what we call it with Arete, we call it skill, stress, context. So the context is a game. The stress, let's go. Context is the game. Other end of the spectrum, the skill is the movement itself. And then stress is how do we put that movement under stress where they're not focusing necessarily on the movement, but it's still a relatively simple task to solve. And then we're putting that into context and in a game-like scenario. So within that skill component, then there's still levels of transfer. So the movement itself is performed at full speed, like it's done in the game. But we can break that down to be performed with slower speeds with things like walking drills or over, like resisted drills or, anything like that, where for me, it's part physical, but also it's about giving the body and the mind and the athlete time to feel positions and feel where they need to be. Because, I could explain something to the athlete, but it doesn't matter unless their body understands. So I have to sort of appreciate because if you're in the middle of the game and you start trying to think technically, how am I supposed to be decelerating here? You're not focusing on what you should be focusing on over there. So an element of it is I appreciate there's going to be some time. Some technical aspects will be developed fairly quickly if certain athletes learn quicker than others. But sometimes it takes time for them to understand that. So there's that technical aspect. And then underneath that technical aspect is physical abilities. Some athletes are going to have different physical abilities, different makeups that's going to allow them to be, they're going to find deceleration easier or harder. Like, one of the most simple ones is height. If you're higher, it's a lot harder from a leverage point of view of the floor to decelerate than it is if you're shorter. So understanding the constraints of the athlete then, what are their, I suppose, anthropomorphic constraints, and then what are the environment constraints they're having to deal with, and you're trying to learn as much as you can about that athlete, about the game, and especially in games like, for me, coming into football a couple of years ago, I'd done a little bit consulting with a team 5-6 years before that, but it was pretty new to me, and actually deep diving into that was an exciting challenge for me to understand and get to appreciate the tactical aspects of the game, which weren't familiar to me. So, you're trying to then understand, okay, what deceleration in football is very different to deceleration in rugby. Rugby's played in front of you. In football, it's 360 degrees. And there's also a lot more accelerations and decelerations. I think, we'd be looking at top end for some of the football guys might be up, if you're looking at 3 meters per second would be something like 130 decelerations in a game. And they're fairly intense. And there's obviously more intense ones above that. And there's different levels to it, but just as a volume of exposure is very, very high. Particularly in terms of efficient UI those movements. Within sevens where I was working before, there's more space. So you're probably going to see, more intense decelerations more often, but the overall volume isn't quite as intense, isn't quite as high. So it's understanding that whole big picture of the demands of the sport, the constraints of the athlete, and then having this framework like our skill stress context framework to give us a starting point to work from. And like I say, so that would usually start slow and then build in complexity.
Nice. So, would you introduce like the deceleration at the beginning through like linear decel and gradually add some multiple like multi-directional deceleration, or you just teach them at the beginning when you teach like acceleration, when you teach like multi-directional movement?
Yeah, so for me, again, if you go multi-directional movement or even lateral change of direction or 180-degree change of direction, one of the first components of that is having to decelerate linearly. It's going to start somewhat linearly, even if in the process of that, you're transitioning into a turn. So personally, in terms of like the skill side of the continuum, we like to focus on acceleration early on. It carries over to a lot of things in terms of how to, it's not necessarily as implicitly understood with athletes as you think it might be, to be able to project and be stiff and to go where you need to go. A lot of them, they just start running because they're used to it. They're not actually thinking, they're not actually clear on how do I project and how do I efficiently get myself somewhere. So we'd start with acceleration, and around the same time, and in the process of all of that, you're trying to understand how much, if they can't technically perform these movements, how much of that is they don't know how to efficiently use their body in that way, or how much of it is physical limitation, that they haven't got the strength to be able to manage the forces and the positions involved in deceleration. But at the same time, like, you don't want to make everything very taut, very mechanical, very structured. You also want chaos, because it's more fun to learn that with games and with contextual scenarios, and B, that's what the game is. They've learned everything they've learned is without anyone teaching them a deceleration drill, and especially if you're working with elite athletes, they're pretty good at it because they have to be, especially in football. But that doesn't mean there's not ways you can look and work with them to become more efficient, and you absolutely can. So your model is based on an ideal of efficiency of movement alongside this problem solving thing over here. And you're sort of bouncing between different ends of the spectrum. With different age athletes, you might spend more time working on that skill element. With different age athletes or different levels of athlete, you might spend more time on the context element. But you're always flowing between them and trying to understand, what do they need right now. With like really young athletes, you're probably not going to spend a lot of time on skill because it's boring and you're going to lose their attention pretty quickly. So you're better off creating games, creating scenarios for them to, that will teach them as well, because they'll have to get better. They have to solve the problem. And that's a lot of how we learn, really. It's not someone walking us through a drill. That's the stress element in that continuum, that skill stress context continuum. The bit in the middle is where we might take something like races. So we're going to go, right, the races from this point to that point, and at first it might just be a straight race, and then we'll start to add, right, now you're going to stop on this cone, or so the winner is the first person to come to a complete stop, not the person to cross the line. And when you do those things with athletes, it's funny because, you could time, say you have a linear race. The guy who wins the linear race isn't necessarily the guy that's going to win the race once you put one change of direction into it. And then you add another change of direction and it changes again. And then I suppose when you're talking sport-wise, you add another level to that, which is now you've got to solve a problem and then you've got to read the situation. So now the guy that wins that situation might be a different guy again. So it's just sort of understanding that, yes, being faster helps. Yes, being able to stop efficiently helps. But there's guys out there who've been playing at the top of their game for a very, very long time who wouldn't perform well in these structured drills, but they're still the best players around because they solve the problem. So I suppose the point of that is to try and have a bit of humility in terms of our role and not try to take time away from what really matters, but actually still hold that idea, obviously, that we can help. It's just we've got to be a little bit thoughtful about the big picture.
Nice. I love that approach. So, you mentioned that you need to know the athlete in front of you, that where are their position right now, what they need right now. So, is there some sort of like test you do to like monitor athletes like deceleration ability, or like the element that they need?
Yeah, there's certainly things we've used and played around with. There's nothing that I would say is like, this is my go-to right now. I do this with everybody, especially not with deceleration. What we've done at the football clubs in the last couple of years is really try and build a profile, a physical profile of the athlete. And that would start with very basic things like isometric outputs with different, so in different positions. You might have like a quad dominant position, like a single leg squat. You'd have a hamstring, isometric, long lever, short lever, so on and so on. So that's just trying to build a very basic idea of their outputs in certain positions, really biased in certain muscles. So it gives us an indication, okay, they're strong here or they're not that strong there. But then you're sort of trying to link that back to that problem. So are we seeing them not solve problems in the game? Okay, the first time we're going to break it, okay, is that because tactically they don't know where they're supposed to be? Are they out of position? Are they creating things harder than it needs to be? If that's not the case, okay, technically, do they know how to produce force in efficiently to perform these skills or these technical models? If actually they do know where they're supposed to be and they seem to be able to do that pretty well, is then a physical determinant. And then you've got what I'd start with at the very bottom of that is isometric force outputs, really. And then on top of that, you've got power and, especially with the counter movement jump work and some of the, we had Daniel Cohen in the other day, and, the level of depth in terms of metrics and what these might mean and understand is fantastic. I've certainly started playing around with some other metrics from the ForceDex output that have been influenced by some of the work of Damien Harper and those guys who have looked into, okay, what metrics here seem to relate to decelerative abilities. But that's not something that I've got enough of an answer on, enough of experience on where there's a go-to test. I'm certainly playing around a lot with things like view motion. I've started playing around with, which I came to via Jonas and the Speedworks guys. And so I played around with that, we've done some great work with that, some rehabbing athletes recently and some really interesting insights. Things like 5-10-5 is something that we've used a lot, especially at end stage rehab. I think it's a really valuable test. How effectively can you go from fast in one direction to coming back in the other direction? That's a hard mechanical task to solve. So I've certainly used that for a while. So there's a load of things, and it's something that's an ever evolving space to try and understand. There's obviously quite a lot of work now being invested into that space, and it's really interesting to see what's coming out of there. Like clarity in the forces involved in deceleration compared to sprinting, compared to acceleration, and how much higher they are, and it sort of makes sense. And you'd probably know that implicitly, but it's so good to see this stuff come out and to gain that deeper level of understanding, like we've done with so many other elements of performance.
Cool. So, deceleration, or the rest like skill or like movement, people always combine it with like eccentric like strength training. So how would you like how would you combine like the skill of the skill of deceleration or like the movement of decel with the work you did with in the weight room?
Yeah, so that's a good question because I think it's again something I've thought a lot about, especially within football. So you've got this awareness that what they're being exposed to in games and in training is a lot of acceleration, decelerations. That's very like fast, 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 fast. Like stress, 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 and probably influenced a little bit by the work of like Keith Barr and guys like that. This idea that okay, well we've got to balance that out with some slower work. I think there's an element of that I like. I think we're doing a lot of fast work. We probably need a bit of slow work as well, just to balance it out. Probably going deeper on that is, essentially the muscles are acting as dampeners in a way in deceleration. We want them to absorb force. We want them to work to absorb force. It's the opposite of acceleration, where we want them to be stiff and, produce force. And one of the things we'll talk about technically in deceleration is you'll see, especially that maybe if you watch like kids decelerate, where they don't have the ability to produce a lot of force, they'll take lots and lots and lots of little steps. And really what that's doing is cheating a way. You're using elastic and like bones to try and mechanically stop, which isn't a terrible idea. Like it's part of your system's ability to deal with stopping a movement. But what you also want to do is be, instead of being stiff and then that movement, instead of the force being absorbed and taken out of the system, it's maintaining it in the system for longer. We want the muscles to be able to take that force on, sit, absorb, rather than stay tall and be stiff and then keep, falling over essentially. So I think the gym for me really is, again, it's a teaching space. We're teaching the muscles how we want them to act, what we want them to be able to do. A lot of the work I do in there would probably be focused on, from a performance aspect, is on being able to move, is to be stiffer, is to be more powerful, produce force more rapidly. And I suppose in deceleration, there is a rapid production of force, but in deeper ranges and with a more contractile element, I think. And I think with speed, it's much more elastic. As you move faster, it becomes more repetitive. It's going to be more elastically dominated movement. And what a lot of athletes don't have is the ability to use that effectively. So part of what we're doing is trying to produce that. I think with deceleration, in some way, it seems to be a more contractile-led movement. As I'm saying that, I'm thinking of some of the best movers I know in terms of cutting in rugby and football are elastic. So, there's in terms of being able to recoil and send your direction another way, the elastic system is going to be part of that. But what I found with some of the guys in sevens is I went with a little bit of an experiment one year and tried to take out more of the heavy loading, deep lifting into the season, because a bit like athletics, you wouldn't be doing that necessarily a lot in tournament season, to see if we could get more speed. And we did get more speed in some. We got no real change in others. Some didn't run as fast. So the next year we added more load, but we still kept the ranges relatively shallow. Other than we'd use deep ranges for health. But from the performance programming, in terms of that would be short ranges. It would be very heavy. It would be fast. What we found with some of the guys that were very, very elastic was that once you took out more of that slow, heavy loading, they actually were a little bit more vulnerable to injuries. And it wasn't necessarily big injuries, but little fascial tears and things like that. And I think almost experientially, I felt that, okay, we need to keep this in some amount in order to keep them healthy. So it's this balance between performance and health, which is what we're doing in team sports. For me, I'm always thinking health first. I want the best players to be available. I want them to be on the pitch. But once I'm confident that they're tolerating the load they're exposed to, and I've got some space to try and make performance improvements, I'm then sort of sprinkling on little bits of what I'd call performance programming, where I'm trying to make them faster, more powerful, and more reactive. So again, it's part of that big picture, and where does everything fit? And there's no one answer, certainly from me.
Nice. So, you mentioned that they're probably the best mover train or like you deal with, they're probably more like have the coil or like the how do I say it? Elasticity. Am I right? So
Yeah, yeah,
if if you take out the heavy and slow movement in the weight room, is there another way to train the coil or like the elasticity for the movement?
yeah. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? You don't need that heavy stuff for the elastic movement at all. I think there's certain elements of the game within team sports or with something like sprinting where you need to be able to produce a lot of force, and that's going to require more contractile dominant tissues to do that. So it's not, I don't think you need the heavy load, but I think, and I certainly don't think it's going to differ athlete to athlete based on how they're made up and how they seem to respond to stuff. But I think you need a bit of everything in order to make the system somewhat balanced and able to deal with the different forces and different challenges that are placed upon it. And like I said, sometimes those challenges are going to be more muscularly dominant, and sometimes those challenges are going to be more elastic dominant. So it goes back to trying to understand the problem that they're facing now. And I think of some of these elastic athletes that I've worked with, and they are super, super elastic and very, very effective within the team sport space. Why are they, when I say they're effective, it means, that problem of having to, they're trying to solve in a pitch of get around someone or get past someone or even close someone down to make a tackle. They were some of the best you'd see do that. So they solved the problem better than anyone else. They also happen to be the most elastic. They also happen to be probably a little bit more vulnerable to injury because their outputs are so high, and they're doing every time they're on a pitch, their outputs are that high. So, the same training session for them isn't the same as a guy who's a bit of a trucker, and even in sevens where everybody's relatively fast, you still get truckers and you still get speedy guys, and I'd sort of categorize them like that a little bit in my head. And that gives you, I suppose, a boundary of expectation. I'm not going to turn the trucker into an elastic guy. I don't want to turn the elastic guy into a trucker, but I've got to understand what benefits and what risks come with those profiles for those players.
Nice. So you mentioned that solving problem a lot of times in our conversation. So is the like we all know that elite athletes have like probably faster time to solve the problem in their brain or like real situation in the game. Is that kind of like element trainable in your experience?
The ability to solve the problem in the game. Yeah, it's in some ways you'd think that's the most trainable because it's the least genetically determined. Maybe there's like some ability to pattern connect or something within the brain neurally that impacts your ability to see the way they see. But usually the guys that are the best have the worst physical abilities. Right. So they haven't had the physical abilities to rely on. So they've had to get really, really, really good at the tactical stuff. And so they've been placed within a scenario that their constraints and they've had to get really good just to make it to that level with, okay, how can I be in the right place at the right time every single time? How can I think 8 or 9 times faster or quicker or slicker than anyone else? And so I think, once you get to the elite level, it's so hard because what gets them there is their sort of makeup. There's how much you're not going to change much. You can certainly with the teams we've worked with, Chelsea this year, a lot of the guys run the fastest speed they've ever run with just a very little sprinkling of stuff they probably haven't done before. So that's quite an easy thing to change in team sports, especially in football, because in certain ways, physically, they're not actually that developed. It's more of a tactical game. It's not determined physically in the same way that a 100-meter sprint is, or a javelin throw, or something like that. And less so than rugby, where you're crashing into each other a lot, and sizes and everything in rugby, but it certainly has more impact there than it does in football. So 100% you can train it, 100% you get better at it. The best teams, I think, do that collectively in an incredibly efficient way. They're not only thinking for themselves and space. They're thinking for them team or like 2 or 3 different people in space and solving that problem. And when you see teams do that, like obviously Man City at the moment, their ability to solve those problems and be like ruthlessly efficient in exploiting gaps in their opponents' mistakes, or whenever they draw their opponent into a mistake and then they ruthlessly exploit that. It's an amazing thing because there's so many levels of complexity involved in that. If you really want to dive down into it, it's amazing. So absolutely, you can develop it. It's probably the most developed. It probably has the most room for development, but how much once you get to that level, because you don't have long in an elite career. Once you're there, you might have 10 years, 15 years if you're really lucky in football to get better in that space. And how far you can get with that, I'm not sure, because most of the guys who you look at as really, really good were really, really good when they got into it, and then they just got better and better. So yeah, but it's that end of the continuum probably fascinates me more than any, because it is the one where that's what really matters. That's where it matters. Can you solve the problem or not? That's them. The problem is always a tactical one first before anything else. What have I got? What's my strength? What's this guy's next to me strength? What's that guy's opposite me's weakness? Okay, how can I exploit that? And trying to solve that in tiny, tiny milliseconds. And being in football, that's the thing I love to watch the most. It fascinates me, the speed they can think, and then technically, technically perform an action under very, very short time frames that has a tactical component in it is amazing. Like, their ability to do that's unbelievable.
Cool. So because like football, there's gonna be a lot of like change of direction or like deceleration, or in rugby. So is there like any certain like injury you deal with that the main reason is probably because a lack of the skill, or like that lack of the movement, or like mm, muscle contraction element for deceleration?
I think, I don't know about one, but there's a lot of non-contact, soft tissue injuries that could be attributed to it. And one for me that I think is more attributed to that than maybe people initially think is hamstrings. I think, the hamstring is massively important from decelerating, the knee, and as you slowing down the femur as you decelerate. And I've seen injuries in football that have come from overload that seem to me to be from change of direction volume overload rather than top end speed overload or high speed running volume overload, just looking at the numbers. And in some cases you wonder, okay, where that's happening and you're getting a hamstring, is it actually saving you an ACL? Sometimes. And then obviously, if you're not strong, if you're not able to absorb those forces, then you are more likely to get worse injuries like ACLs. We know obviously in ACLs there's a massive time component and a reading component, but again, that's links back into this problem solving. So how well do you solve the problem of the game? And it going back to rehab, if you're not doing that in your rehab before you put them into team training, or you're not sort of appreciating that team training is overloading that quality in a way that you haven't overloaded it for the whole rehab, you're going to get problems and you're going to get re-injury. So I mean, most little soft tissue injuries, I think, that come up, you're going to say could be related to the adductors. You're going to get quads. You're going to get a little quad tears, jointy things. There's a lot, really. It's certainly with axle diesel overload and volume overload early in preseason, you'll see a lot of backs and lumbar issues, and in younger athletes especially. It's such a massive part of the game. Most injuries have that, especially in team sports, obviously, have that as an underlying element to it. Yeah.
Cool. So wanna go back to like the test you do? Can you like give us some example about like, let's say in the linear deceleration, is there a certain test you think is helpful for you to like categorize athlete? And when it comes uh like multi-directional movement or like change of direction, is there like certain tests or like a few tests you would recommend for like young coaches to test it?
I suppose the simplest one and the one that's more traditionally been used is like your 5-10-5. I think that is a good reflection of your ability to. There's a problem is there's quite a lot wrapped up in it, right? So there's your initial deceleration and there's your change direction and reacceleration. So in terms of skills, it's actually looking at quite a few things. So you could be good at it or bad at it. If you're bad at it, what part of it are you bad at? So you're then going to want to try and figure that out. I think Sophia and Emphasis work on that in terms of like looking at it as a percentage of, so it's like a COD deficit rather than, an overall time is brilliant because that's then looking at it, you're able to zoom in on it as a quality rather than just looking at the time as we would have before. Now you're starting to go, okay, well, they've got a great time, but as a percentage of that time, they're really bad. So then we can hone in on what we need to focus on. Whereas if they have a poor time and we're not honing in on that as a percentage of that poor time, we're thinking, oh, okay, do they need to get faster? Do they need to be better decelerating? Do they need to be better at reaccelerating? There's a lot of things in that. So that's one that's, I think, very useful and very, very easy to do with a lot of athletes. Like I said, I've been playing around with the view motion stuff, which Jonas Stodu put me onto. I've been playing around with that with some of the footballers recently, and it becomes one of these things where, like with force decks, you could take something where you jump, and then instead of doing it on a jump mat, now you're doing the same movement, but you're getting all of these metrics and all of this insight and all of this viewing under the bonnet sort of thing. And I think with view motion now, and those similar things that can do that, and using AI in terms of, you're getting basically a timing gate, you're getting kinematic analysis, you're getting a speed gun, so you're getting acceleration curves as well, all in one. So I think and all I'm doing is filming it like I'd have been filming it before. So those sort of like technology progresses I love. They're so exciting to me because it's like, I can do the same thing I was always doing, but I can get all this information back. And the challenge then becomes trying to figure out, okay, what am I paying attention to and how do I deal with all of this information? But that's a better situation to be in than not having any information, right? So I suppose like, I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm up to date with the research in terms of where it's at from a deceleration perspective. Like, I suppose with how I am, and I'd get bits of it and I'd pick bits of it up and I'd read little bits, and it's, I'm not I suppose in being on the ground a little bit, it's so fast moving. I'm probably not great at going, right, I'm going to, every now and again I'll delve really deep into something when I face a problem I can't solve and I'm trying to have to, okay, well, actually what's going on here then? So I wouldn't say I'm like really up to date with where research actually is on the deceleration work. But I know some of the stuff that Damien Harper's been doing particularly, and there's a few others, but looking at, I suppose, like differences from penultimate step to final step and timings between them and stuff like that would be very useful, because that's a way of going, okay, what we're trying to define deceleration, we're trying to put a number on it, and once we have a number on it, as long as we appreciate what the number actually represents and that it doesn't represent everything, then we can start to find value in that number. So I think starting to use things like that would be something I'd like to, at the moment, explore a little bit more and look a little bit closer into. But the challenge is time, and that's why it's great. There's guys out there looking at it so closely, so we can skim off the top and try and take what's valuable and bastardize it probably a little bit for our own needs.
So, there are coaches like this going to like discuss like the, let's say, watching the movement for like acceleration and deceleration. There's going to be a huge difference when you land, the position you land, the position your foot land, or the shin angle. Can you like talk to us a little bit about like the shin angle and the foot position?
Yeah, so I suppose, I said about like kids and how they move and how they'll use their bones and their elastic tissues efficiently because they haven't got muscular forces. There's lots to learn in that, So part of what we want to do in deceleration or in acceleration even is like, how do we efficiently align these more stable structures to help us move in the direction we want to go, or to slow down, resist the forces that we want to resist. I suppose then there's an element of, without the contractile abilities, you're unable to put yourself into those positions, or you overload those tissues in a way that they're not necessarily ready for. So, naturally, if I want to accelerate this way, I don't know if my camera's backwards or not. If I want to accelerate this way, I want to align my my shin, my femur, my spine, my everything into that direction. So now I'm having to reverse that movement. So position of the lower limb is going to be massively important. I always say to athletes, it's easier to push over a tall tower than a low tower. So, instinctively, you want to be dropping your level. Now, how much you want to be dropping your level is going to be dependent on the situation, depending on your size, depending on your abilities. But you're going to be dropping your level. So I did some work into this with some of the sevens boys, just almost like this was before view motion and things like that were available. And it was just looking at video and stopping it and trying to understand that. And what you could see was that if some of your penultimate steps, I'm not talking like one step before or two steps before, I'm talking 3, 4, 5. If you don't get those right, and we're looking at just a simple 180 change of direction, we were looking at, that will hugely impact what happens down here. Because if you don't manage the forces down here, then you're going to have more force than you're ready to deal with down here. And positionally, you're not going to be able to reorientate yourself back in the direction you want to go efficiently. So what we'd see where guys got it wrong, instead of being able to almost like, so part of, I suppose it's hard to demonstrate on screen, but part of what you're trying to do in a 180-degree change of direction, for example, is decelerate very efficiently. But in the same process of doing that is rotate and reorientate yourself back in the other direction. Now, if you get to that point of stopping and you've done that very well, you're in a position that basically you're almost trying to make that, how close to that position can I make it to the mechanics I'd want from a linear acceleration? Because accelerating linearly is the most efficient way I can move in that direction. That's why all of sprint 100 meters and 60 meters is a massive part of being able to be effective in that, because how efficiently can I go in that direction? So doing that linearly is the best thing we can do. When we're changing direction 180 degrees, how close to that can we get? And that's how we set up. So when I'm working with athletes on that, I'll talk to them. I'll say, look, I'm going to be very, very detailed about this for this little purpose of this drill for this moment, because I think you should understand how to efficiently move yourself in that direction or in this way when you haven't got any constraints, when you haven't got any problems to solve, so that, and then you sort of trying to then integrate that into the stress components, like I was talking about, where you're racing or where you're actually trying to do something in the game. So that just comes out in the game. But I've got to accept there's going to be a lag time, teaching this and then it happening and coming out. So, but I'm still doing those things together. So part of that is, how do you orientate your upper body? So you're decelerating and you're dropping your level, and then there's going to be a change in your foot position. Where you place that final step is going to determine whether I need to turn a big corner around my hips or whether I've got a straight line from my foot past my hips and then becomes linear acceleration again. So like you can go like really, really detailed in that. And I'm always conscious when I'm coaching of, okay, how much do I want to overload them with this detail and how much do I not? And then you're trying to decide, okay, today I'm going to go detail, or today I'm just going to get them to perform it maybe as a race or maybe as a timed thing. So then, they're just trying to solve the problem and they're trying to put the pieces together. So I'm not always giving them answers, because ultimately that will, every time you give an athlete an answer, it's constraining them for a moment. It's giving them a little box to fit in for that moment. So you've got to be really careful about when you choose to do that, because half the time your answers are so they're so small in the in the bigger picture, that it's not guaranteed that you're making things better. So you have to always be thinking, okay, is this actually making them better, or is it giving them structure for my benefit? So I feel like I'm giving them structure. So I'm always trying to weigh up those things, and I'll try to keep that. I'll try to have that conversation openly with athletes to say, I'm going to tell you some stuff. It's an exploration. We're trying these things, and I want to see how you feel when they happen. And we're going to talk about them, and then we're going to see if it feels more efficient, and then we can time it, and we can do other things to give us more clear output and indicators. So, yeah, I've got this saying, like, beware of those who offer answers. So, there's no fixed answers to anything. So it's all an exploration. So I'm really, when I'm working with athletes, I'm seeing there's a bit of an exploration into how we can help them move more efficiently and solve problems better.
Nice. Last question before I let you go, okay?
Yeah.
So, as coaches, as performance coaches, I learned from like, let's say like exos or like the paper. There's like shuffle, there's like crossover, there's like open step or like uh hip turn. All those movement we like or we learn from like other facility or like the paper. But uh when we teach athlete, does they really move that way in the game situation?
Yeah, that's a
Or
good question.
does it help athlete or after we teach it, does it really help athlete move better?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's one I'm always wondering as well. So in our model, when we sort of come up with it, the skill stress context. So essentially, you've got skill stress context along the top. You've got linear, lateral, and then transitionary movements along the side. So for me, linear movements would be acceleration, deceleration, top speed. They're the categories of linear movement broadly. The lateral, you've got like a shuffle or crossover step, and then transition is anything in between that, because we're only really ever moving forward or sideways. If I'm going diagonal, it's usually like I'm sort of sideways, sort of forward. It's not that. So that's how we sort of break down the skill elements. My thought with the shuffle, so you'd use that more in rugby than you would in football. But I think there's a benefit to athletes in understanding, like, again, it's like the general skill of effectively moving in that direction as efficiently as you possibly can. So if you develop that as a general skill, part of then what you're trying to do with the other drills, the context drills and the stress drills, is give them a place to explore that efficient movement. So I do think there's benefit in teaching someone to linearly accelerate as efficiently as they possibly can. I do think there's benefit in teaching someone to laterally move as efficiently as they possibly can. How often in the game is it going to look exactly like that? Is varies for everyone and for the situation. But if we're teaching squats for an efficient way to pick up a barbell on your back, which is what a squat essentially is. You can do it very inefficient ways with a rounded spine, or you can do it with very efficient ways. That's all we're really doing, is how do we do it efficiently? I think why not be doing that with things that have more transfer, like acceleration, like deceleration, like lateral movement. So I don't think it needs to fit the game. This idea that most most discussions in performance end up being like it has to be all like perceptual, or it's all general. We probably need both, right? So what our job as coaches to go, when are we going to get the benefit from a general focus? When are we going to get the benefit from a very contextualized perceptual environment, and what sits between that? And then when do we use different bits of that toolbox to solve the problems we're finding with athletes? And so yeah, I don't know if it matters if it doesn't occur like that very often in the game. I think there's benefit. But like I say, you still need to have that appreciation always that the best players are the best players because they're the best players. And that we can pick any of the best players in any sport and there'll be all sorts of inefficiencies, as we'd like to call them, from a very structured coaching point of view. So it's just trying to appreciate everything in that picture, really.
Love this, love this. So, for those who are interested in what we are talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
So maybe on Twitter or Instagram. I couldn't tell you exactly what they are. It's Tom Marite something on one and Tom Marite something on another one. But that, a website, ariteperformance.com, arite-performance.com, sorry. You can contact us through there. I'm not great at writing technical articles. I probably have better at just being asked to do podcasts like this and waffling on for a while and then seeing what comes out. But yeah, I'm available to contact online. I'm always happy to chat and love chatting through ideas with people as well.
Cool.